What if the feeling of being ashamed at being stupid is one and the same thing as being positively motivated to try to become intelligent? You feel ashamed about being bad and stupid and ignorant and wrong. You feel bad about being poorly spoken, unable to express your ideas in a clear and convincing way. That feeling of shame may not be separable from, it may not be a replaceable or extricable component of what we describe in other contexts as a positive motivation. I've grown up in a culture where I feel I'm surrounded by people at all ages, at all socioeconomic levels, who simply embrace dumbing out. They feel no sense of shame in being stupid, in being ignorant, in being poorly spoken. They're not afraid to appear to be an idiot at all. They embrace it. Our attitudes create habits. With the passage of time and repetition, our habits shape who we really are. I cannot boast that my YouTube videos are short, blunt, and to the point. However, I make videos that are blunt and to the point. Whether or not they're short varies a great deal with the topic at hand. We're going to discuss scientific research in this video about a topic that nobody reflects on scientifically. The role of shame, the role of negative motivation. Quote, negative emotionality was expected to impair learning from errors by decreasing motivation to learn. Jumping ahead to the sentence highlighted in green, contrary to the prediction, a positive association was found between negative emotionality and motivation to learn. Why would this be surprising, whether we're discussing this issue autobiographically, philosophically, or scientifically? Why would anyone be surprised to discover that, as we used to say, shame is the mother of learning? Now let's talk about the spectrum of shame for just a moment here, because some of you may be thinking of extreme examples of shame, and some of you may be thinking about very trivial, very small scale examples of shame. All of them have to be considered in this examination. I had a video recently talking about drug addiction, and I quoted several people who quit drugs, and they really spoke positively about how feeling ashamed of themselves as drug addicts was crucial to their gaining the motivation to live a life of sobriety, to change their lives, to give up drugs, so on and so forth. One of them said specifically and movingly that she felt ashamed to walk across the courtroom in chains in front of her own mother. Her mother, who had given her everything, her mother who had given her so much support and educational opportunities in life, who had set her up to succeed. Now she was walking in front of her mother with her hands and feet in chains. She was ashamed, and she got positively motivated to quit drugs. I have all my life heard similar anecdotes from drug dealers. Very often, people who were experienced drug dealers said that they didn't feel ashamed at all when they were dealing with the police face-to-face, and you can imagine the kind of bravado that they feel the police are their opponents, their enemies. They maybe don't feel ashamed when they're facing down the police or facing down the jail cell, but then they have the experience of seeing the expression on their mother's face, their grandmother's face, their aunts and uncles' faces, maybe their brothers and sisters' faces. They see how shocked and disappointed and ashamed their own family members are when it's revealed that they have been a drug dealer, that they have been arrested, that they're facing these charges. And very often they will reflect that this shame powerfully motivated them to start a new life, to change what they're doing. This is not uncommon. This is frankly ubiquitous in the human experience. Although we can't draw up some kind of simple rule or some kind of simple conclusion that shame gets results, it's very clear to all of us that shame often plays a role in motivating us to adapt, to change, to learn. That shame can in so many ways be a good or positive thing. And over at the sort of minuscule end of the spectrum, all my life people have perceived me as being gifted at public speaking, being a very skilled orator, being very good at face-to-face, person-to-person conversations. I grew up with a tremendous and intense sense of shame whenever I happened to use the wrong word in conversation, whenever I happened to stumble over my words in conversation. And nobody taught me this. It wasn't that I was ridiculed by other children or ridiculed by my parents. It wasn't that I was given encouragement one way or another by my teachers. I felt ashamed if I spoke poorly, if I said the wrong thing, if I misused the word, any word. And I would often remember very precisely what it was I'd said wrong and what the error was, and I'd agonize over it, and I might wake up the next morning regretting it. No reason. Why do we presume that speaking well and feeling ashamed of speaking badly are two separate things? What if they are, in fact, one and the same thing? What if there isn't any particular desire in me to speak well? What if there's just this negative motivation that I don't want to be an idiot, and thus I end up over years developing myself into a more intelligent person? I've grown up in a culture where I feel I'm surrounded by people at all ages, at all socioeconomic levels, who simply embrace dumbing out. They feel no sense of shame in being stupid, in being ignorant, in being poorly spoken. They're not afraid to appear to be an idiot at all. They embrace it. Our attitudes create habits. With the passage of time and repetition, our habits shape who we really are. People who have this kind of shameless and relaxed attitude to what they say, what they read, what they know and they don't know, fashion themselves into shameless, thoughtless, foolish people. And yes, there might be an opposite extreme of someone who's very reluctant to speak because they're so afraid of saying the wrong thing. Someone who's very reluctant to commit to an opinion because they're afraid of and ashamed of being wrong. But that self-same shame can propel you forward to do research, to cultivate an informed opinion, to become a well-spoken, highly effective, highly intelligent person. So how do we come now to be in this culture that presumes that shame is an entirely negative thing, that propounds this doctrine that nobody should feel ashamed? The fat should not be ashamed of feeling fat. The lazy should not feel ashamed of being lazy. The ignorant and the stupid should not be ashamed of any of their failings, much less should they feel a positive motivation to make something better out of themselves. How did that become the predominant cultural discourse in 2020? And let me just ask you, do you think it can last? I did quite a lot of research on the history of education when I was living in China, Dehong, Yunnan, China. And I presented a series of lectures to my students. I was teaching at a university at the time that related to him. See there, I misspoke. I presented a series of lectures to them relating and contrasting the history of the development of education in Europe to East Asia, North America to England, Scotland, Italy, various centers of education in the history of Europe, and asking the question, how is it that a country like the United States has become in many ways the unquestioned model of what university education should be, or even what primary and grade school education should be? Is there instead a Japanese model we should look at the history and development of? Is there instead a British model, an Italian model, a French model? Talking about the history and philosophy of education in this pragmatic way. And one of the questions I got interested in personally, and that I involved my class in discussing, it's a series of lectures at the university, and there were homework assignments and so on. Why was the history of education in Scotland so different from the history of education in England, right next door, or indeed any other major European power? One explanation that immediately resonated with me, because I myself have experience living in Scotland when I was a kid, about 12 years old, was just the blunt statement in one of the books I was reading on this, that the Scottish had, during those centuries, an intense culture of shame surrounding personal ignorance and lack of reading. And that more important than the particular arrangement of classes in the school system or specific educational policies adopted by the government was the Scottish culture of openly reviling people for having failed to have read a book, of making one another, basically ridiculing one another for their ignorance. Which again, I experienced myself, whatever it is, centuries later when I was living in Scotland. And that connected to this was the intense Scottish culture of the book club. The books, of course, were much more expensive in the past than they are today. Very often people couldn't own books or build up a library themselves, but people would join book clubs. The book clubs would give them all a copy of the book for 2 weeks or whatever it was, and then meet and discuss the book they read in a circle. They'd return the book to the book club. There also, by the way, were book clubs where one or two actors would read the book aloud while others listened. This is a form of reading that's much forgotten today, basically performing a book for an audience. But there was this tremendous pressure in Scottish society for a man, in order to be a man and be taken seriously, to at all times be reading serious books. The way this was written, and the frank admission that this wasn't something glorious, inviting, or pleasant about Scottish culture, but that this was in fact really something quite bitter and nasty in Scottish culture, of people upbraiding each other for their ignorance. I could immediately relate to that, and it brought back memories of Scotland. And frankly, just how openly cruel and vicious my own school teacher was in Scotland compared to a school teacher in Canada. I couldn't imagine a teacher in Canada insulting and denigrating me the way that teacher in Scotland did. And I think she did it to just about everybody. That was also part of their culture. They had just recently abolished beating students with the strap. And to mention this also, it wasn't purely intellectual, the shaming that went on in Scotland. They forced all the boys to go to gym shirtless. So again, I was, I think, 11 at the beginning, and then later 12 when I was in Scotland. So you haven't really gone through puberty yet. And the gym instructor would openly shame the boys who were getting fatter or more out of shape, or the boys who had less muscular development than the others. So this extended to fat shaming and body shaming in school openly, so on and so forth. Any kind of evaluation of the real-world outcomes of shame, including the one in this scientific study, has to address the history of religion, North and South, East and West. There can be no doubt the reason why most people alive in 2020, and definitely most people on the left wing, presume that shame is something completely counterproductive and negative in our lives. The reason for this assumption is that the Christian religion attached shame to myriad things that are completely unproductive to be ashamed about. Now, this is going to get more difficult to deal with, not less, as the 21st century goes on. If you are homosexual or if you are a lesbian, you may recognize that it's completely counterproductive to feel ashamed of it, and it may nevertheless be very difficult for you psychologically to get to grips with your own sexual identity. I don't think that's easy. I don't. However, the Christian discourse of shame that was attached to sexuality entailed absurdities of enormous scale, not just making all homosexuals feel regretful about their homosexuality. It made all heterosexuals feel regretful about their heterosexuality. Heterosexual men convincing themselves that it's something debased and demonic that they would ever feel attracted to a woman other than their lawfully wedded wife. Women feeling it's something debased and demonic that they should ever desire to have sex with more than one member of the opposite sex between their birth and their death of natural causes in old age. And people really trying to hypnotize themselves into this ideological sexual identity. Now, Christianity is not the only religion we can fault here. Obviously, Islam and Judaism are very much birds of a feather in this respect. I think anyone who does social science research would recognize how profoundly different all of the discourse surrounding shame is when you switch to a Theravada Buddhist culture like Thailand, or even a very peculiar mixed Buddhist and Shinto culture like Japan. There seemed to be absolutely no doubt surrounding the assumption that a criminal should face up the karmic consequences of his actions and feel ashamed, that a drug addict should feel ashamed, and indeed drug addicts were being dragged into Buddhist monasteries and signing up for 100% shame-based programs in which the religion was actively involved in, motivating them to, they go through withdrawal and so on, and motivating them to lead a life of sobriety. Completely overt discourse about what it means to be a man and how ashamed of yourself you ought to be if you fail to live up to this standard, basically constant mental alertness, vigilance, and sobriety. Shame, 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 shame. Now, there is an interesting question for the social sciences. Is shame more effective than any particular possible alternative to shame? I want to emphasize here, there may not be an alternative to shame. Philosophically, we have to start by asking, as I said much earlier in this video, what if the feeling of being ashamed at being stupid is one and the same thing as being positively motivated to try to become intelligent? You feel ashamed about being bad and stupid and ignorant and wrong. You feel bad about being poorly spoken, unable to express your ideas in a clear and convincing way. That feeling of shame may not be separable from, it may not be a replaceable or extricable component of what we describe in other contexts as a positive motivation. We may just be talking about two different ways of describing one and the same thing. The most important finding of this study is, however, that virtually no research has ever been done in this field on this question. The study includes a review of the literature that I think is much more important than its particular findings. And the review of the literature says basically, built into this field of study is the assumption that negative emotions are negative. That things we call bad, like shame, have bad outcomes and couldn't possibly play a positive role in motivating learning, in motivating positive personal change. That assumption is profoundly false. And the fact that there has been almost no research in this area, I think, reflects a deep 21st century cultural impetus, a kind of willing ignorance, the fact that many of us simply don't want to know.